All right. So, we've got this stack of reports and articles here all about the digital skills gap. And, it's a lot to unpack. But we're going to really dive in and break it down. Think of it like a cheat sheet for the future of work, right? We'll figure out what skills are essential, what's just hype, and how it all affects, you listening right now.
Yeah, and what I find really interesting is it's not even just about knowing how to use the latest tech anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's about understanding these different layers of digital skills that you need to really thrive.
Okay, so unpack that a little bit. What are we talking about here when we say layers?
Okay, so imagine this. There's this whole baseline of digital literacy that's becoming non-negotiable.
Sure.
Just back in the day, you had to know how to read a map or send an email, right?
Right.
It's just expected. Now it's this. But in a world where everything is online.
It's like the new baseline, like breathing.
Exactly. And then on top of that, you've got this next level, right? The specialized digital expertise. Think AI, cybersecurity, those cutting edge fields where companies are desperate, scrambling for anyone with even a little bit of experience.
So it's almost like a double whammy. You need the basics just to get by, but then to really excel, to really stand out, you need these specialized skills that are in super high demand, but also probably changing all the time.
Yeah, and that's what I thought was so interesting about the digital skills students will need for the future of work report.
Yeah.
They really lay that out well. It's not enough to just be able to use the technology. You need to know how to use it to solve these complex real world problems.
Right. And speaking of that report, they didn't really sugarcoat things, did they? It sounds like those EU goals of 80% of adults being digitally savvy and having 20 million tech specialists by 2030. It's a nice thought.
It's going to be tough.
It's going to be tough.
They ran a simulation, and it's not looking great. Unless there are some major changes in how we're approaching, digital skills in education, we're not even going to come close.
Yeah, and that's what I think is so important for everyone listening to grasp. This isn't some far-off problem for, future generations to deal with, right? This is about our careers, our ability to stay relevant, maybe even our job security in the next few years. This is happening now. So, okay, how do we make sure we're not part of that group that gets left behind? What are the actual skills we need to be learning to stay ahead of the curve?
See, and this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because one of the reports you shared that digital skills students will need for the future of work, one, they really dig into the specifics. And it's not just about knowing how to code or whatever. It's a whole different way of thinking about problem solving altogether.
Okay, so less about memorizing formulas and more about thinking outside the box, being able to adapt.
Exactly. They actually call it complex problem solving. And the thing is, these aren't your straightforward, here's the problem, here's the solution kind of thing. This is about navigating ambiguity. Things are constantly changing, so you need to be able to constantly adapt your approach as well.
Oh, and they had that whole method for it too, right? The ratio method.
Yes.
Reflect, analyze, target, implement, observe.
It's like the scientific method, but on steroids.
Totally. And they gave that great example with manufacturing, right?
Yeah.
Imagine a whole bottling line goes down, and instead of everyone freaking out, they use this method to troubleshoot it step by step.
And you're constantly learning and refining the process as you go.
Right, which actually, now that you mention it, that kind of leads into the other big thing they talked about, right? Creativity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because as automation takes over more of those repetitive tasks, it's the people who can think creatively. They're the ones who are going to be in high demand.
So all those years of doodling in the margins of my notebooks in high school are going to pay off. Is that what you're saying?
Well, think bigger than doodles. This isn't just about being artistic, right? It's about being able to think differently, coming up with those innovative solutions, seeing opportunities where other people just see a blank wall.
Right.
And they actually had this really cool example about how this is playing out in retail.
Right.
Because everyone thinks, retail's dead, online stores are taking over. But it's not about being replaced. It's about evolving, right? So salespeople are becoming more like consultants. They're using data to create these really personalized shopping experiences.
Yeah, and that's a really great point. It's not about being afraid of the change. It's about figuring out, okay, how do we adapt? How do we actually leverage this change to our advantage?
Exactly. And what's the key to adapting and really thriving in this constantly evolving landscape? The human factor, they called it.
Right, all those so-called soft skills are suddenly not so soft anymore, huh?
Exactly. Collaboration, communication, empathy, the things that robots, at least for now, can't really replicate.
Right. And it's not even just about, working with other people. It's about being able to process this, like this flood of information that's coming at us from every direction, right? And that's where I think those visual processing skills are going to be huge. It's like, being able to filter out the noise and actually focus on the signal.
Oh, absolutely. Now, while that report really honed in on those specific skills, the other one you sent, The Future of Education for Digital Skills, it took a little bit of a different approach. They had this whole thing about like DigComp 2.0.
Okay, DigComp 2.0. Yeah, tell me more about that, because that one was new to me.
Right. So imagine if you had like this universal translator for the digital world, something that helped you decode not just how to use the technology, but like how to actually understand its impact on our lives. Right. That's kind of what DigComp 2.0 is getting at. It's like a framework.
Yeah.
It breaks down digital competence into all these different areas that go way beyond just the technical skills.
So it's like less about can you code and more about do you understand how this technology is shaping the world around you?
Yes. And you know what I thought was such a powerful example in that report? They talked about the COVID-19 lockdowns.
Oh, yeah.
It was like, someone hit fast forward on this whole digital transformation thing. And the people who already had those foundational digital skills, they adapted. They were able to keep learning, figure out how to work remotely.
But the people who didn't,
they were left behind. And it really just exposed how crucial it is to close this digital skills gap, because it's not just about keeping up with the latest gadget. It's about making sure that everybody has equal opportunities in a future that's, only going to become more and more reliant on these digital skills.
Yeah, it's kind of wild to think about how quickly things can change, right? Like,
Yeah.
It really highlights how urgent this whole digital skills thing is, because it's not just about keeping up. It's about being ready for whatever is coming next. But, I mean, whose job is it to make sure everyone's up to speed? How do we make sure education is keeping pace with all of this change?
See, and that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And both of the reports you shared, they point to some opportunities for improvement, especially when it comes to public education.
Yeah, one of them actually used the phrase fragmented fundamentals, which sounds like a nice way of saying we're kind of all over the place.
It basically means that every country is kind of doing its own thing when it comes to digital skills education.
Right.
Which, on a global scale, makes it almost impossible to make sure everyone has even that basic level of understanding.
Right. Like, we're not even working from the same playbook here.
Exactly. And the thing is, it's not even just a problem at like the elementary school level. The reports also call out universities. Like, there's supposed to be these hubs of, cutting edge knowledge, but they're often so slow to adapt their curricula.
Well, and you end up in this situation where people go to university to prepare for the workforce, but then they graduate and it's like, wait, nobody told me about this. Like, they're learning stuff that's already outdated.
It's such a disconnect. Though, there are some bright spots, right? Like, some universities are starting to partner with tech companies, like IBM, to offer more of that hands-on experience, working with those cutting-edge technologies.
Right.
It's that kind of forward-thinking approach that we need to see more of.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, it sounds like the public sector maybe needs a little bit of a reality check, but what about the private sector? Shouldn't they be stepping up and taking a more active role in bridging this gap?
Well, you would think so, right? But it's tricky, because on the one hand, you've got all these amazing nonprofits doing great work, providing those like really foundational digital skills. But there's this huge chunk in the middle, right? People who need that more advanced training, but don't necessarily have access to those, crazy expensive private academies or boot camps.
So it's like, we've got the basics covered, and then we've got the super specialized stuff, but there's this gap in between, and nobody's quite sure who's responsible for filling it.
It's the messy middle, right? But we are starting to see some of the big tech companies like Apple, Amazon, they're realizing, hey, we need to invest in training our future workforce. Whether it's enough, that's another question, but it's a start.
Yeah, and there's one example in the report that really stood out to me, Code Cool. I don't know if you remember that one.
Yes.
They actually train people in these super high-demand digital skills, but they only get paid if their graduates get jobs.
I love that model. It's like, they're putting their money where their mouth is.
Exactly. And it really speaks to that whole, like, 4 futures, 1 choice thing that the report lays out, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So, okay, for anyone who might have missed that part, remind us, what are those 4 possible futures we're looking at?
Okay, so basically, it all depends on how we address this skills gap. So one possibility is we end up in a world of digital selectiveness.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, the public sector kind of steps up, but the private sector is still lagging behind some progress, but a lot of people get left behind.
Right. Not ideal.
Not ideal. Then there's digital plenitude, which is like the dream scenario, right? Everybody wins. We've got a workforce that's digitally fluent. We're closing the gap between, the haves and the have-nots.
Sounds lovely. Sign me up for that one.
Right. But it requires a level of collaboration and investment that honestly we're not quite seeing yet. And then the other two scenarios are a little, they kind of highlight what's at stake here if we don't get this right.
All right, so hit me with the not so optimistic ones.
Okay, so you've got digital widening, which is basically the public sector just doesn't really adapt. And while the private sector tries to compensate, that gap between those who have the skills and those who don't, it just keeps getting wider and wider.
And I have a feeling the last one isn't going to be rainbows and butterflies.
No, not quite. Digital deprivation. That's the worst case scenario. Basically, we fail to adapt. We fall behind globally, and it leads to, economic stagnation, a society that's just completely unprepared for a world that's becoming more and more digital.
Okay, wow, we went from 0 to 100 real quick there. It's like, it's not even just about learning to code or knowing how to use the latest gadget. It's about the kind of future we're creating for ourselves, for our kids, for generations to come. It's a big deal. And I think the important thing to remember is if you're listening to this, you're already ahead of the game, right? Because you're thinking about this stuff. You're asking the right questions.
Absolutely. Awareness is key.
And that is huge. That's a great first step. But now, here's something to think about. If you were in charge, what would your ideal digital skills program look like? Who would it target? What would it teach? How would you make sure everybody has access? Because like we were talking about, this isn't just some far-off problem. This is happening now. And the future, well, it depends on the choices that we make today.